And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm very excited today to be joined by Derek Yoo. He's the founder of Moonbeam, one of the first 5 parachains on Polkadot. We're going to talk about interconnected, interoperable blockchains. We're going to talk about where things are with DeFi and a whole bunch beside that. Derek, how are you doing today, my friend? Are you well?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on here, Anthony.
You're very welcome. It seems like you're at home, so probably not in Korea with everybody else or in Singapore for Token 2049. Getting a bit of time to actually get some work done?
That's what this time in the market is for all of us, I think. Yeah, so for sure. And I'm usually grinding away here in my office. For those that know me, this is like the same background that you always see me in this kind of my attic office here.
This is the Bat Cave. This is where the good stuff happens. So anyway, Derek, I know you've got a lot going on, so thank you so much for joining us. For those people who don't know, let's start with a little bit of an introduction to Moonbeam. Tell us what Moonbeam is about, the kind of the origin story, if you will, and then we can get into a little bit more detail. Does that sound good?
Sure, that sounds great. Yeah, I can give a bit of background. So just quick on myself. Like I've just been building software a long time. So that's mostly Web 2, but then since 2019 in the Web 3 space. Really the project that has been like the focus of a lot of effort has been Moonbeam. So what is Moonbeam? Moonbeam is a smart contract platform, but it's specifically designed to support like interoperability use cases. So I think we'll talk a bit about some of those a bit later. I know there's a bunch of interesting scenarios we can talk about. But yeah, a huge amount of kind of interesting kind of experience from kind of coming up with the idea for the project, implementing the protocol, then being involved with, seeing it go live and the ecosystem grow around it. That's been like a quite interesting and informative experience. And yeah, I think the main contribution that's coming from myself and the company I'm with is around like the protocol engineering side, right? So kind of supplying like again the software that's kind of provides the implementation for Moonbeam.
Got it. Very good. And we definitely will talk about interoperability because it's an important topic. It's been much said, rarely delivered, and I know Polkadot has been a big part of kind of the enabler for that, or the original vision behind Polkadot. Full disclosure, I have worked at Parity. I'm very familiar with the Polkadot ecosystem. So for those people listening in, I've always wanted to have Derek on the show, and I'm glad that we finally managed to make it. And we'll definitely talk about interoperability, kind of the state of blockchains and where things are at the moment. Also, the proliferation of layer 2s and layer 3s, because it feels like we're launching chains on chains on chains at the moment. And there's very many different ways to architect decentralized apps, to architect the decentralized internet. And everyone's having a go at it in a different way. So I'm really excited to get into a little bit of depth on that. Before we get started, everybody, this is a LinkedIn Live. We've got Derek, captive audience. So if you have any questions, if you want to ask him any questions about Polkadot, about interoperability, about DeFi, about the EVM, about anything related to building in Web3, Derek is here. So please do ask your questions. Put those in the chat. We're already seeing people coming in, starting to give us their GMs. Let us know where you are in the world. Always excited to know where the audience is tuning in from. We've already got guys coming in from the US, from Tenerife, and from Portugal. So shout out to you guys for joining us. Appreciate you wherever you are in the world. Derek, I mentioned Polkadot, and when you're starting to build a blockchain, you've got a few questions to ask yourself. Am I going to roll my own? Am I going to build on other people's open source technology? Am I going to fork? In your case, you went with Polkadot. Talk us through a little bit about the origin story for you around wanting to be one of the early parachains, and what was the decision process for you?
Yeah. So I think that it really derives from kind of the vision that like I have and what we're after, like what our mission is. So to explain that vision, I mean, and this is true from when we started the project, even, and it really hasn't changed appreciably much at all. So even like back from when we started the project in 2019. The vision was like, look, there's going to be many blockchains. This is not going to be a world that has like 1, 2, 3 blockchains. There's going to be, I would say not even thousands, like hundreds of thousands. There's going to be many, like ultimately blockchains. This is like a foundational technology that's been created. And those blockchains, I don't really see a world where those are all the same. I mean, there's going to be different kinds of specialized like blockchains. There are all kinds of different issues, just like with computers, right? You have ones that you wear on your wrist, you have ones you keep in your pocket, you have ones that occupy like a whole building. Like, so there's just different like use cases for like these different blockchains. There's going to be specialization. And so with that lens in mind, so first of all, there's going to be all these different blockchains. The question is, well, how do you build them? And to me, when we looked at that, like you can build one from scratch, but just as with like Web 2 apps, like, there's these frameworks that like help like make building like blockchains like easier. And so that was obvious. Like, look, we're like we want these blockchains to be useful, and like the less time we can spend on low-level plumbing and the more time we can spend on the actual features that our customers care about, the better. So what are the blockchain frameworks out there that will help us do this? And at the time, that was really Substrate and like Cosmos SDK were like the two choices. And our team has preference for Rust, and like there was a number of other reasons why Substrate like made sense. Now, I think the other part of the vision though is that, okay, you have these many blockchains, how do they communicate with each other? And this is where Polkadot, again, so it provided this like blockchain building framework Substrate, which it would make it way faster and easier for us to build a blockchain, and allow us to focus on the features that our customers care about. But then it also, Polkadot has this kind of concept of how those blockchains interoperate with each other, right? So you're part of this like shared network. You can then send messages, so-called XCM messages, from yourself to other chains. And so to me, those are the two critical capabilities, right? You have a way to build these specialized things. You have some kind of system that you can like interoperate with other chains, because they go hand in hand, right? Because if you're going to specialize on something doing one thing well, it probably means you're going to do a bunch of other things not well. So then being able to interact with other chains, you can kind of leverage, okay, like I'm going to be good at this thing, I'm not good at this other thing, but let me go interact with this other chain that is specialized in that thing I'm not good at. And so that's kind of was the overall concept. And I think that still holds true today, although the market landscape has evolved a bunch. I think those ideas and those principles are still remain true today.
I really like that. I was having a conversation with a colleague before, because ultimately Web3 or the decentralized internet is really about the applications we build. If you look at the acceleration of AI in the last 3, 6, 12 months, the reason why we're seeing so much excitement or usage around it is because of the applications, right? ChatGPT gives you a prompt to get you access to low latency, high powered compute to solve search type problems, or Midjourney allows you to prompt and the AI interprets that prompt into creating visual images. Those are applications that save people time. Web3, like you said, blockchains are infrastructure. They're foundational technologies. They're not the apps themselves. But part of the power of the kind of the vision that you portray is that you've got multiple chains that do different things well, where you can have smart contracts interacting across multiple blockchains, that one may be really good at tokens, one may be really good at swaps, one may be really good at interoperability between chains, one may be good for real world assets, one may be good for Bitcoin. Right? The application you build will take those components, not just say, well, I have to do everything off this one blockchain that's available and that's all I can use. Or rather, when it's done well, it should be enabled by that, and I feel like that's where we're heading.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I kind of one of the goals that I think about is, as a Web 2 developer, we're specialized in developer infrastructure, right? But as a Web 2 developer, you go into something like AWS, you have this whole menu of different services to choose from, right? Compute, database storage, file storage, identity services. There's this whole menu of services. So I think my overarching vision is like, it would be so amazing if like you could have the same kind of concept, but with like decentralized services instead, right? So like, let's say I take, compute from one blockchain, I take like a, file storage from another chain, I assemble all these services, but I'm building my app, leveraging all these pre-existing services. And then as a result, I have this like super scalable, application. I think I'm quite confident things will head in that direction. Basically, that's the direction things are going to head in.
I think so. And shout out Carlos for a question here. We'll already jump into questions because it kind of feels like it's on topic now. And this is probably a clarification point here, is we're talking about interoperable blockchains within the Polkadot ecosystem, which I think is kind of the broad topic here, and be able to compose from those different blockchains to create apps. But I guess in your case, it's also interoperable between blockchains. So Moonbeam connects out to the EVM, to Ethereum as well.
That's right. So, and I think this goes back to the, I talked about kind of the original vision and some of the choices, but like obviously the market has like evolved now. So, where I see things now is that, this idea that like let's have like an ecosystem of like specialized chains that are able to talk to each other. That idea has taken hold in multiple different ecosystems now. So you almost have these like multiple enclaves of like interoperable chains, at least envisioned or like possibly existing, because you have AVAX subnets. You've got like all the L2 ecosystems have at least some vision of like, let's have multiple of these roll-ups, but then let's also build some sort of way they can interact. The optimism folks are furthest along on this. So I see it as like the world's moving into this kind of state where there's multiple enclaves. Cosmos, another enclave, but you still need to like connectivity like between these different enclaves to kind of connect them, because they're all somewhat separate, right? And have separate like ways of, they operate under their own security domains, let's say. And so, that's something that's changed a bunch since we started the project. But, a lot of again, it kind of remains the same. And I would say that, the vision on a lot, like if you look at these L2s, a lot of them are not so specialized. I would say that the specialization is like one of the weaker points there.
Yeah, I think so. You're looking at less functionality. I see we're getting the low-hanging fruit, which is mostly, or a large part, is scalability for Ethereum. So rolling up multiple transactions to allow us to do more transactions. Ethereum has a lot of liquidity. It has a language that's relatively standardized that a lot of people learned. You've got some challenges with not having an account model, but that's okay. We kind of there's a direction of travel going on there, but it's a big, heavy beast. Right? It's decent as a settlement layer, or it's decent as an anchor chain, but flexibility or variability, I think, is less powerful. When you look at Polkadot ecosystem, the intent is that there is an underlying chain that provides shared security, but it's up to the Moonbeams of the world and the other chains to be able to create some of that functionality, or the additional functionality that the main chain shouldn't need to.
No, absolutely right, and of course, like, and I kind of had a little bit of these digs on the L2s, but of course, even the idea of Moonbeam. I mean, I think the EVM tech stack is like quite dominant, right? And like, I actually think the dominance is increasing because a lot of these like new environments are just EVM only. So you kind of have this like network effect now, like happening around like the EVM tech stack, which is is very sticky, basically, right? And so that was one of the original ideas of Moonbeam, is like that, since that's a dominant tech stack, let's make sure that there's every one of these like enclaves like needs its EVM environment, basically, right, to be able to interoperate with like all of these like tools and like with the rest of the world. And so that's one of the roles that we see Moonbeam playing, like in the context of Polkadot.
So let's get into that. And I was surprised and delighted, I guess, to hear the other day that Moonbeam has, and correct me if this is correct, 1 million smart contracts. There are 1 million smart contracts approximately deployed on Moonbeam today. Talk us through that. That's an unfathomable amount of smart contracts.
Yeah, I think it's obviously there's like been quite a bit of like great like traction, like user traction, like ecosystem deployments. So that's like actually quite gratifying to see that the software that got created, that it's like gone on to live. It's much larger than like any one of us now, and this is a whole ecosystem. Why did that happen? I mean, I think it actually dovetails on this last point, right? So I think that it's obviously being part of a larger ecosystem. Like that's like an important point these days. I think it's very, very difficult these days to like launch. It's like, oh, I have some blockchain. I'm going to like launch a new standalone blockchain that does X, Y, Z. That's pretty hard these days. I would say that like, things are consolidating where either you're part of the Ethereum security domain, maybe you're part of Polkadot security domain, maybe you're part of, Avalanche. I mean, it's hard to basically like create your own like new enclave at this point. So that being said, it's this EVM thing. I think that is like, if I attribute like anything product wise to traction that's happened on Moonbeam, it is this like EVM. So like early on, we did a lot of work on productionalizing like an Ethereum implementation in Substrate, so that we could offer, like Moonbeam could offer this like EVM compatible environment. A lot of work went into like making sure that it was fully compatible with all the tools and technologies, wallets out there, bridging technologies. So I attribute like a lot of the traction that Moonbeam was seeing simply to that, right? That like, if most of the other users out there are already familiar with that, they already have a MetaMask wallet, they have these things. If they're coming to like a new ecosystem like Polkadot, chances are they're going to start with Moonbeam, because it has like most of like the routes, like connecting people like into Polkadot from, say, Ethereum mainnet, and it's already compatible with all the wallets and other things that they already know how to use. So yeah, I think that if there's any single like product like decision or reason that like led to like that being a reality, I think it is this focus on Ethereum compatibility, and by doing so, kind of having it be kind of the lowest friction place for people, a lot of people to deploy, having it be compatible with existing technology, wallets, other things that people have. That's definitely like part of the story. Other part of the story, I'd say, though, is around like having a focus on things like security and reliability, right? So it's just I think there's just launching a blockchain, even with the frameworks, is still can be difficult, and so just having the right focus, making sure that any software created is secure and reliable. That's takes a lot of energy and effort, and so that's, I think, another part of how Moonbeam has found like traction and success is through that.
So important lessons there for anybody building anything, right, Web3 or not, is take away the friction points for developers, take away the friction points for users. Right. Yeah. So if you've got context, or if you've got the capability to deploy Ethereum smart contracts or support entire dApps across from Ethereum to Moonbeam, that's a low friction way of somebody saying, okay, I'm going to make an application or part of my platform available to people in Polkadot.
That's right. I think that's right. And then the driver that I saw, like for a lot of early teams, was just, hey, I have this existing thing, like DApp protocol, what have you. It was developed for on Ethereum. I'm interested in deploying to Polkadot. Like there's all these users and assets there. The easiest path for me to do that is to deploy to Moonbeam because I can leverage my existing, this existing code base I have or this existing implementation that I have.
Yeah, sounds pretty straightforward and simple. But within those million smart contracts, do you see a particular grouping, or do you see a particular segmentation of different types of applications? Because if you look at Web3 more broadly, we started with chains, then we had coins, then we had decentralized finance. We're starting to see identity, gaming, a number of other applications starting to emerge. What are you seeing as the kind of the established smart contracts on your platform, and what are you starting to see emerge?
It's a good question. I would say that like an initial focus area was definitely around like DeFi. So a lot of the early folks deploying were different kinds of DeFi protocols. Now there's a whole DeFi ecosystem on Moonbeam. So that's almost a baseline. I'd say that's like and I think that right now Moonbeam in some ways is providing kind of the default DeFi venue for Polkadot, right? So a lot of people are using XCM to transfer like tokens like onto like Moonbeam to then participate in like or interact with different DeFi protocols. So that's something that's happening like now. In terms of newer things that I'm seeing, there definitely have been and continue to be different kinds of NFT activity. I'd say that's shifted. So it shifted, I think, in the early days more towards like uh, crypto native, like PFP collections, this kind of thing. These days, it's more around like a kind of enterprise like use case. Interesting. There are like several kind of like more I'd call like real world or enterprises that like have shown like interest in deploying NFTs like of different kinds like to the chain. So like I think that's interesting. And I'd say gaming is like is the third area where we've always had like some degree of like of games on the system. In fact, if you look at some of the top drivers of transactions like these days, it is games like on the system. So folks like X-Out Racers, Everloot, there's like a number of different games. They tend towards kind of I'd call it like kind of the more indie kind of like end of things, but they have definitely like strong communities and interesting offerings.
Nice. And interesting to hear enterprise in there, because I think providing you can make the technologies easy to consume and you can tell a competent story about the decentralization of the chain, the security of the chain, the kind of ease of upgrading, et cetera, there's nothing stopping or necessarily stopping enterprises starting to tokenize assets, physical, digital, art, invoices, whatever else it might be. So it's kind of positive to hear that that's still happening, and particularly on a public chain that is an EVM focused chain. I think that's good news. How do they come to you? How do they find Moonbeam?
I think that like part of it is like the way I think of it is this, right? So developer infrastructure like Moonbeam is the customer is the developer basically, and so there's what do developers want? It's like, well, they need secure and reliable operation, so that's kind of a given, maybe the baseline. But beyond that, it's around like having great like developer docs, right? So like having great developer docs, having great support. So I think these are areas where the community and like ecosystem around Moonbeam is quite strong. So like for example, if you're a builder, you need like support, like a kind of like DevRel type support. There's even a whole like organization that's just focused on providing like DevRel services like to Moonbeam as part of the ecosystem. So I think people undersell that a lot, but sometimes that's like what developers want is just like good, clear documentation. They can like do things, and when they do hit a problem, they can like there's somewhere they can go to get like good quality support. I'd say that's like a big part of how there's just been traction and success on Moonbeam as well.
Also good learnings there. The documentation, I mean, I remember some of the early documentation, sort of 17, 18, was awful. You were literally flying blind, depending on which chain you were, whether it was a private or public chain. You were just kind of having to hack around a little bit yourself. Even the early days of Bitcoin, people wanted to mine Bitcoin, but kind of gave up. Even some people who were moderately technical were like, hosting a node and being able to do mining here is just too much for me. I'm out. This is too difficult. It's not worth the 10 cents that I'm going to make. Little did we know, but I hear you. And let's help level everybody up on developer experience, because it's not just about the documentation. It's also not just about you having to provide the support, right? In a world where you've got communities and ecosystems, it can be peer support, it can be community-led support, it can be grant-based rewards for providing great support. It doesn't have to be that you have to have a bank of 10 people sat in an office somewhere waiting to help, but it's how you orchestrate that help, I think.
That's right. I think that's right. Mm-hmm.
Where are we with DeFi? That was my next question, and something that I definitely wanted to get onto you, because again, you've seen, from the lows to the highs and then back to where we are now, somewhere in the middle, around the kind of the evolution of decentralized finance. Some of it was very basic around the early protocols or dApps that were focused just on lending or lending against crypto and so on and so forth, allowing that to be automated. You then started to see collateralized lending against NFTs or things that could be valued, and then started to see some slightly more sophisticated derivatives. We're starting to talk about ETFs now as well, which is for good or bad. Whether we actually need that or not in crypto is an open question. What's your appraisal of where we are in terms of the current maturity of DeFi and where are we heading?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I mean, just to comment on DeFi in general, obviously I think at this point in the cycle, like a lot of the casual users are gone basically, right? That's both a blessing and a curse. So I think that, a lot of teams are really focused on like the product and, sustainable economics and, these kinds of things. I see that as healthy and good, right? And like the bar is like pretty high now. Like DeFi is a very competitive space. So I think that the teams that survive and get traction, that they're like, they're of good quality. I think the downside though is that like without a lot of users, it's hard to get feedback, right? So I think this is critical in like building products is you need this like feedback loop to kind of continue to iterate your products. So I see that is kind of a struggle that some teams have, and right now it tends towards this kind of pretty specialized like power user set, right? There's like folks that are like very familiar with using DeFi and other things, and in some ways that's a danger because they're just have all this knowledge and are not representative of what like your common kind of like everyday user is like. So that's tied into what I see as like the kind of the key friction points for crypto adoption in general is still around UX. But all that being said, like obviously like things continue to like iterate and like evolve like pretty quickly. The areas in general and where I see interesting activity happening on Moonbeam would be in the LS DeFi, the so-called LS DeFi space. So this is around like staking derivatives. There's a number of new projects that are launching different kinds of like liquid staking tokens like on Moonbeam. So that's an area. And you look even like outside of Moonbeam, you go to mainnet, you have things like Eigenlayer that's like driving like this narrative as well around and just Ethereum staking in general, right, is like one of the areas or subsectors like within crypto that's like gotten a lot of like attention and interest. And so I do see that as kind of interesting. On Moonbeam there are further developments happening. Like there is like a Uniswap deployment that's like in flight, like onto the Uniswap DAO is like decided to like deploy to Moonbeam. So there's that's kind of in the works behind the scenes here. And these RWAs, I mean, I would say that that's the other area that is of interest. We have there's a fellow parachain Centrifuge that's been like a long time builder in this RWA space. So there's kind of integration collab that's underway with them. But I see that as like pretty interesting. And back to that, what does DeFi get used for? Yeah, it was crypto native use cases like initially where you're just kind of either lending and borrowing pure crypto assets. But I see like a healthy future for these RWAs where there's a number of like good quality projects that are kind of tokenizing different kinds of real world assets. That could be even something as simple as like US treasuries or other kinds of things, so that when people want to enter into those kinds of assets, they're not leaving crypto. They can stay in crypto and like use some of the benefits there, but still get exposure, to some of these things. And so I think, some of the things that I think are interesting are just like the banks and institutions in general. And like a lot of them have these blockchain efforts underway. And I think that there is, a good likelihood that a lot of like the next wave adoption would come from institutions. Now they have requirements. A lot of them have these KYC and other requirements, but like, there is like definitely like interest and movement happening like in this area on Moonbeam and elsewhere. So I'm pretty bullish on that, even if like kind of by the numbers, like DeFi is at like a relative low point right now.
I think it's a good time. And again, jumping straight into the question, because it is relevant, it's right there. Have you had any institutions or traditional banks contacting you for integrations or project work? No need to disclose anything confidential, or if this is top secret, no worries.
Yeah, no, I'd say that there's been some conversations, but nothing that I can kind of publicly talk about. But like I would say that right now, and it's again, like I would say that most of the people I interact with tend to be more towards this like crypto native end of the spectrum and less about like I call them, the suits basically, like the world I came from earlier. But there is definitely like action going on that end. A lot of these banks, they have whole like teams of developers, other people like building Web3 infrastructure. So I see that as like I see a lot of people preparing for what they like a future where like they know that like Web3 systems are going to be providing the backbone for settlement for like a lot of different kinds of products. And so, a lot of these banks just they know that they need to get like they need to get skilled in this area, or else they face becoming obsolete. So yeah, I know there's probably opportunity for even to be kind of like like a vendor, just software vendor to those to those organizations like these days, because they're doing a lot of in-house building now. It's like very inefficient, is what I've seen.
Indeed, and anybody who thought kind of banks are waiting for the next wave or whatever else it is, there are very many banks with more developers than a lot of protocols,
Yeah.
which is kind of an interesting thing to observe. And you could kind of got to ask, well, what are they building? Part of it is that actually the internal systems that they're trying to connect to are incredibly sophisticated. In some cases, banks are building their own blockchains. They are building digital asset chains that have particular languages or that are easily interfaceable into their existing systems or into global systems or payment systems, whatever else it might be. That's a part of it. But I like the idea of Moonbeam being a vendor, or being at least a software delivery partner, to be able to say, well, we could plug in an EVM-ready, Polkadot-based digital asset platform that you can deploy something, right? Whatever else that might be. You may not be getting as much liquidity coming from the Polkadot ecosystem as maybe from capital markets, but until we build the rails, until we start creating applications where people can start seeing value. I mean, if you look at staking rewards as well, Polkadot's pretty good in that respect. And that's probably going to be attractive for people who may be interested in accessing Polkadot staking rewards somehow. Always
That's right.
do your own research, not advice, not investment advice, none of that sort of stuff. But as we're thinking about it, certain blockchains have staking rewards that are comparable or maybe even better than what percentage rates, and I'll say that carefully because it's not necessarily value, but percentage rates or percentage growth rates that may look better than most banks' basic lending rates or basic borrowing rates. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I see some of the key challenges I see though are around KYC kind of challenges, right? So this is like where existing these institutions, they have certain requirements they need to meet. So then you have ideas like, okay, well, maybe you make a chain where there's like KYC permissions needed to even like have accounts on the chain. I think that's one approach. That I'm not sure if that's going to work, right? So like rather like some of the more sophisticated approaches I've seen are like, even there's protocols in an open environment, there may be certain kind of like whitelist or KYC restrictions like on like certain protocols, but then they're still operating in an environment with many other protocols. And so I think that's kind of this kind of like hybrid approach is something that I think can work well.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about that one. Midnight, the project I work for at the moment, is a data protection blockchain where we have a public and private ledger. So you have account model and EUTXO. You have the ability to do both shielding of transactions and gas fees, which you can't do on Ethereum. And you also have the ability to do the same usual transparency you get from any blockchain or distributed ledger. The challenge is not that we embed KYC at the protocol level, though. We have the flexibility of what you shield or what you don't, where you include credentials or where you don't. And that kind of gets solved at the application level. For me, is having a blockchain plus KYC, I think is challenging, where you could enable an application that plugs in a KYC credential that's been validated off chain, and you can allow all of the usual on-chain stuff to be unstoppable, 24/7, low cost to deploy, low cost to settle, etc. You've got a huge amount of potential, and I think it's not because we don't have the infrastructure to do it. I think it's the creativity and capital hasn't been pointed towards it yet at an application level. That feels like it for me, but I don't know if you have a different take on it.
No, I think that sounds right. And like I think that it's also obviously there's different kinds of constraints and requirements that like a lot of these players are trying to figure out like how they navigate like right now. So I think that as that becomes clearer, then it'll become clearer like what the engagement model can be for these folks. So that's, I think a lot of that is, at least in the US, that's like what people are trying to like figure out now.
For sure. And then you've got a whole bunch of different jurisdictions as well. You've got the way Japan's looking at blockchain at the moment, which is pretty progressive. You've got Singapore being a financial center of the world and being particularly bullish and has always been active on blockchain and crypto. MICA in the European Union. Africa remains open for business and has had some of the strongest financial innovation ever. I think it's important for those listening in to remember that the world is more than just the US, although the US is probably the noisiest and the one that does lead on regulation in some cases. But there's also a huge amount of opportunity for financial innovation in the other 209 countries in the world, or whatever the categorization is. So I'm still positive that financial innovation will out, and where we are in the kind of cycle, both within Web3 and both with the macroeconomic picture, when we start seeing more capital deployed into innovation, we're going to see an uptick. We're going to see more creativity and better, because at the same time we're also building on open source code. So it's not like we have to rip it up and start again. It's that every time that we deploy a different DAO, every time that we deploy a different smart contract, every time we see an exploit, we can learn and advance, which I think is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, agree.
Let's talk about developers and community, because this is one of the hardest yards, I think, in blockchain, is starting to create the network effects of a following. You've got to 1 million smart contracts. Right? I don't know what that looks like in terms of developers or in terms of community, but that's a phenomenal amount of activity, a phenomenal amount of code deployed onto a blockchain. What have been, without disclosing too many trade secrets to potential competitors, what have been some of the kind of key tactics or key wins that you've seen in helping to grow that developer community? We've already talked about documentation. We've already talked about DevX. What else goes into that?
Yeah, I think those are part of it. The having a product that like solves like a real problem that people have. That's like another part of it. I would say that obviously the community is like more than just developers. So I think having a strong kind of community around like around like in the ecosystem, that's also very helpful, because those are folks that not only become like users of like things, but then also like are helping in like many other ways. I think on Moonbeam that a very strong community like emerged like pretty early on. Like we had like a very successful ambassador program was one thing that we did, like where the idea was like kind of structure like a program where there's like ambassadors that like are enthusiastic about the project, but they then in turn will go and kind of recruit like other folks to be like ambassadors. You have this kind of almost a tiered cake system where it's kind of like the older siblings taking care of the younger siblings kind of idea, right? So then it's like that I think kind of setup was effective in just kind of bootstrapping kind of a community around like the system. I think when I think about what this so the first like kind of initial thing I mentioned is this like having a good product, right? So this was the EVM solving these problems, allowing developers to come in, allowing them to access like users like and assets like in Polkadot. I think that's still like a big driver of the activity on Moonbeam. So that above all else like is something that helps get those contract deployments. But when I look towards what some of the next things are that we're that in terms of features and other things that have been worked on, a lot of it has to do with there's a few different areas of investment, I'd say, or kind of like where where like there's focus happening from the community. One is around like governance, right? So like we've been Moon has been a very early adopter of like a lot of the very like awesome and advanced like governance technology that's like comes like from Substrate and Polkadot. So I think we were one of the first chains to like launch OpenGov, which is the new kind of governance system, way more advanced than like anything else out there, right? I think a lot of people don't realize. And so like every aspect of Moonbeam is governed like from like from this like fully on-chain system. It's like very granular. You can like all sorts of different parameters can be changed, upgrades. So that's like a very powerful thing, and has been like I think a key thing around which to like kind of activate the community, let's say, and kind of rally the community. And then second area has been around these like cross-chain use cases. And so I could spend a little bit of time talking about that, because I think this is kind of the evolution beyond like this like base EVM functionality. And the idea is, as a developer these days, I think it's very, very hard to just choose like one ecosystem and stay put, right? So it used to be traditionally you say, okay, let me go look at the universe of different like blockchains I can deploy to. Okay, I pick even the popular ones like Arbitrum, so let me just deploy to Arbitrum. That doesn't really work these days. The whole like the entire crypto like ecosystem is small enough where like you can't just be on one chain and kind of that's very limiting to your TAM, your addressable market for whatever it is you're building. So I think almost all builders are trying to figure out, well, how do I kind of reach users and assets across different chains, basically, right? Because that's only in aggregate that I'm going to have a protocol that like can gather enough like usage and utilization to like be successful. And so that's really the kind of builder and approach that we've been trying to really like optimize like Moonbeam for. And so, yeah, we just see these like new kinds of builders that are trying to figure out, how do I build like an app that really spans like multiple blockchains, but even, and ideally kind of hides away the blockchain, right? So the users don't even know what blockchain they're on, but you're able to kind of span like multiple different ecosystems and reach all these users everywhere. And so that's like the thing I'm probably most excited about is, there's a lot of innovation happening in this area. There's like all this new infrastructure that enables that. And yeah, we can go into examples of that, but like, these kind of like, I'd call them native cross-chain architectures is one of the things I'm most excited about, on Moonbeam these days.
We absolutely must go a level deeper on that, because I think that's important. It's not as simple as just saying I can communicate, or I can send a message, or I can send a token between one chain and another, or I can send I've got a secure bridge between Ethereum and Polkadot, or between Ethereum and Moonbeam, or I can send a message to Centrifuge and send it back. That doesn't allow you to build an app. That just allows you to send a message, right?
Yeah.
The infrastructure behind doing that is a lot more to the story. And again, to what I said at the beginning of the show, the challenge, I think, as to why Web3 has moved slower in some cases than we've seen other technologies or AI more recently, is the speed of developing the apps, or developing apps that scale, or that are accessible at scale. So please do take us a level down on that, Derek, because I think it's important.
Let's use an example, because I just spoke with one of the builders in our ecosystem actually just yesterday, so it's a little bit fresh in my mind. So the protocol, just to give an example of what this this kind of new kind of architecture looks like, I'll give is there's a protocol deployed to Moonbeam called Prime Protocol. This is they're in the it's a DeFi protocol, so they're in the lending and borrowing space, but they have this new native cross-chain architecture. So let me explain a little bit how that works. So they have what's called a hub and spoke architecture. This is one of the patterns that we're seeing. So in the hub and spoke architecture, you have one chain as your hub, and then you have many spoke deployments like that have remote contracts on a bunch of other chains. So in the case of Prime, the hub is on Moonbeam, but there's like spoke deployments on many other chains. So BNB, like Ethereum mainnet, Arbitrum, Optimism, the list goes on, right? A bunch of different chains. And so the idea is that like in this Prime system, you can say, let's say you're on Avalanche, you can say, okay, let me deposit like AVAX on Avalanche. That then sends a message back to the hub on Moonbeam saying, okay, this user Anthony deposited like this much, like, AVAX on Avalanche. And so it records that. Now, if you go to mainnet, you can say, okay, let me borrow like USDC. It queries back to the hub and says, Anthony has this amount of collateral in the system. Let me allow like up to this much USDC to be borrowed like on mainnet. And so simple to describe, but if you think about it, what's happened here is that you have a single app. It's deployed across like multiple chains. It uses these like new general message passing systems to like connect all these different deployments. But from the user perspective, they're interacting with one system, even though it's like deployed to like all these chains. And so I think, and even from an efficiency standpoint, to like connect all your assets on these different chains is useful and valuable, and something that you can't do if you have isolated instances of that app on all the different chains. So it's kind of competitive with like this like isolated islands approach. But I think the key thing is that like it's kind of this blockchain agnostic experience then, right? So like, yes, you're on Avalanche, but like you're kind of interacting with the same app regardless of which chain you're on. And so I see this as like a very a big improvement in UX, a big improvement in efficiency and what you're able to offer the user. And this TAM expansion. So now that from the developer's point of view, it's like, look, I can go I can interact with users on any chain, that I want. So I think this is at least the near-term future looks like, is more people realizing this and adopting this. And so this is where we're kind of like optimizing, making sure that Moonbeam is a great place to have this hub, which it is, by the way, because, for example, is again, in this hub and spoke architecture, you want like a hub that is well connected. So like Moonbeam has a lot of connections to a lot of different chains. It supports, all the major GMP providers, Axelar, Layer 0, Wormhole, Hyperlane. But it also needs good finality. So, you look at like L2s or anything Ethereum based, like the finality is 15, 20 minutes. It's like that makes it like not great for being a hub of one of these hub and spoke like architectures. It means your users have to wait a long time. If you have a faster finality chain like Moonbeam, then like for all these cross-chain interactions, you're still able to provide feedback to users much faster, and the system is much more efficient. And so this is where I think there's a competitive advantage. And in this world, I've heard it kind of people made the point to me, be like, well, Moonbeam's kind of been buried like a little bit in the background here, right? It's this coordinator, it's this thing that's kind of coordinating actions, even if but maybe most of the users are interacting with the system from other chains. But you know what? I'm fine with that. This is kind of Moonbeam as like a backend cloud, as something like, kind of the backend engine facilitating things. I'll take that all day long, right? Because we're seeing like a lot of transactional volume is being driven by these like remote interactions. I think that's the way of the future, right? It's like create this blockchain agnostic experience. Don't have the user understand like all the pieces of plumbing they're interacting with. Hide that away. But then, yeah, there might be 5, 10, 100 different blockchains you're interacting with behind the scenes, but you don't know it, right? You don't want the user to have to know that and click approve 100 times to like be interacting with all these different back-end elements.
Absolutely. Really great description. And Jean-Michel, my friend from Malta, has kind of chimed in almost as you said it at the same time, blockchain agnostic is the way. And I mean, blockchain agnostic, I think, is maybe an oversimplification, because you still do have some considerations on coding, like you said, on finality, on performance, on security, right? To some extent, the more chains you add, the more integrations you add, potentially the more risk you add if they're not appropriately decentralized, or you add risk the more bridges you add. So I guess as the dApp builder is orchestrating its ecosystem of blockchains, they will be, it's on them to make sure that they're providing a relatively risk-free service, or that they're connecting to chains that have a low risk of being hacked, or bridges that have a low risk of being exploited. The more native you can go, the better. But
I think that's right. So, I mean, the key capability here is in the cross-chain like messaging area, where, as we were discussing before, if you're in Cosmos or Polkadot, you have this kind of like native system, right? In Cosmos, it's IBC, and Polkadot is called XEM for sending messages. That's secured like at the base layer itself. So that's like the best like kind of system. For a lot of these like cross-chain techniques targeting EVM chains, which is where we see a lot of interest because that's where the users and assets are, then you're in the realm of these like overlay networks, like those GMPs I described, like Axelar, Hyperlane, Wormhole, layer 0, and these kinds of things. So like that's like, and there are some different trade-offs that happen there, but there are some interesting developments that I'm seeing here too, right? So like one of the things that we have actually an initiative underway, but like one of the things that we're seeing is basically like people developing more sophisticated like routing and redundancy schemes around these like GMP protocols, right? So it might be that you don't want a single thread to like a particular one, like, I'm going to like all in on like Axelar or Wormhole or layer 0. Instead, you might say, you know what? Let me like optionally route like that my message across any of the three, or maybe like I even want to say like let me send it across all three in a redundant fashion, and then on the remote side, like I need to get at least two of three of the message like before I proceed, right? So then there's like a redundancy built into the system. Or let me even have a lever where I'm on Axelar, but like let's say there's maintenance or something happening, and then I pull the lever and then I'll send my messages out like Wormhole instead, right? So it's like we're seeing kind of teams that are kind of where messaging is a critical part of their architecture are kind of figuring out then how to create like higher degrees of like redundancy and reliability, like, around these like GMP systems.
That's super interesting, because we're starting to see traditional computing and infrastructure management disciplines are starting to appear in Web3. In the same ways, we've started to see scaling become important. We're starting to see decentralized compute and storage starting to fill up, whereas previously we'd have centralized. We're now starting to see redundancy management as well.
It's exactly right. I see it as like, because I'm old enough to have been around, like, but like, yeah, I see it as very there's a lot of like that whole kind of history, like rhyming, not repeating, but like, around things like networking. So it's like if you think of blockchains as computers and these GMPs as the network connections that connect them, this is stuff that like happened in the early days of the internet. Is you need like redundant like connectivity. You need two network providers, right? Or you have some failover between them. It's like these same concepts I think are coming in. It's like the domain is different, but the underlying ideas are similar to things that I've seen in these other domains.
Which I think is an indicator of maturity. I think that's a good thing. We're solving gradually some of the traditional computer science problems that have always existed, but for a different architecture. Decentralized architectures are by their very nature more complex. I think they are more performant in a bunch of ways. They are less performant in others. But I think we all believe that there are certain or very many instances where decentralized applications are worth believing in and worth enabling more people to deploy. We're only just starting to see scale on enterprises, and I'm delighted to hear that Moonbeam is starting to see excitement around tokenization from enterprises on an EVM chain on Polkadot. That to me is a really great indicator that we haven't all drunk the Ethereum Kool-Aid and we're not all just deploying everything on Polygon, that there's actually genuine curiosity and objective analysis going on to say, well, which chain does matter? Is it about finality? Is it about decentralization? Is it about code base? Is it about the other components I can plug in? Substrate being modular, right? Being able to plug in a Bitcoin palette and an NFT palette and a governance palette into an application or a capability that I want to build, that's when we really get the interesting stuff. That's when we get the actual innovation that people want to use, as opposed to just moving coins around and borrowing against them. But it was always going to take longer for us to get there. I wonder, let's talk very briefly about layer 2s and 3s, because we've kind of touched on it, but I want to kind of maybe put it to bed. Is we are seeing proliferation of scaling solutions. We're starting to see roll-ups. We're starting to see zero-knowledge solutions starting to move a little bit further, or maybe not further away, but certainly starting to enable data protection, and in some cases privacy. I mean, not quite two sides of the same coin, but different ends of the similar spectrum.
Right.
We're starting to see problems being solved by layer 2s that layer 1s have, and layer 3s starting to solve problems that layer 2s have. Right? So data availability on rollups. Right? We're using rollups for scaling, but we struggle to get the data availability, so we'll have another chain underneath that to make sure that we've got data available for decentralized applications. It starts to feel a little bit like we are not kind of sticky taping, but we're kind of, again, solving one problem at a time and then realizing, oh, that didn't quite work, so let's do this. Or we don't want everything transparent all of the time, and we can actually do, it's quite easy to correlate data, Chainalysis, make a living out of it, if everything's transparent all of the time. So maybe we want to be able to have selective data protection or shielding, and some parts of our transaction be transparent. Oh, how do we do that? We can't do that with the blockchains we have now. Got to do something else. Do you feel that this exploration of layer 2 and layer 3 capability is adding competition as you look at it from a Moonbeam perspective? Or are you saying, you know what, I'm very comfortable in my skin, I know what we're good at, we sit into an architecture that we believe is proven or that will prove itself over time? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that, like, I'm kind of an anti-maxi, right? So I don't think that it's all going to collapse to, like, being like one chain or one system or another. It's all about trade-offs. I think when you build blockchains, you realize that there's just this like fixed trade-off space, and like, yes, you can innovate and you can kind of be clever about that trade-off space, but in the end, there is still some fundamental trade-offs that have to happen. So, and if I look at the L2s, obviously they've done a huge amount to scale like a transaction on Ethereum. Ethereum is still the center of the universe in like many ways in terms of users, liquidity. So you can't like deny that. Like that just is factual. I think if I look at the L2s, the state of them is like, I think that they have there's some challenges like there, right? And like it's interesting to me that like a lot of people aren't so fixated like on the challenges. So that like one thing is that there's this big trade-off that's been made on almost all the L2s of kind of execution and throughput, like but sacrificing decentralization, right? So like almost all of them at this point still have I think they all do, a single centralized sequencer run by the team. And you could say, well, there's like, in the case of a ZK, it's like they can't really put through like a bad transaction. Like, okay, like I get that. But like, it's still just having a single sequencer is like a problem. So, let's just be specific, right? Earlier this week, I think was it yesterday, 2 days ago, Base was down for 45 minutes because the single sequencer like had a problem basically. And then the team was like trying to fix it. So that's just like a liveness problem, right? Like instead of, on Moonbeam, there's 80 like block producers that are like in a permissionless system that like can come and go that are producing blocks. So if any one of them has a problem, there's 79 other ones that can like pick up the mantle and like carry it forward. That's like a more robust system in my mind, right? That's like something that's more resilient to failure. But like I said, like there's trade-off, right? So like, I mean, what do you get in exchange? You get super fast block times, you get like higher throughput. So there are things that you do get. I think the other thing, if I were to like think about it, is that you take something like Substrate or Cosmos SDK, you have a huge amount of developer expressivity and customizing, like the logic of the chain, right? You can make a storage chain, you can make like a DEX chain, you can make all sorts of different like things. Whereas all of the L2s are generally just almost all of them are just like you can have any color you want as long as it's a vanilla EVM, right? You get an EVM and then you can deploy contracts on it. That's kind of what you get. Now, I think that's still good. I mean, Moonbeam, like we obviously went to the EVM path, so that gets you a long way. But I think I think people will realize over time that there are certain things that the EVM can't do. Like let's say that you want to make a file a storage optimized chain. That's like likely not going to be EVM based, right? Or the EVM model doesn't like work as well if you're trying to store like large amounts of data in a decentralized way. And so this goes back to that specialization. I see this like as, the L2s may evolve to like allow for further customization, but I think a lot of them are kind of anchored on the EVM idea. and you need these like modular like building frameworks like Cosmos SDK or Substrate if you really want to like customize like the chain implementation. So yeah, but like I see that I see this as like there's like a mutual coexistence like of these different things. And obviously, like at the moment, like the narrative is dominated like by the L2s and L3s. I think probably the most interesting thing is the thing I already mentioned, that for all these like L2 ecosystems, the big ones at least, they're adopting a Polkadot like narrative in the sense that they're saying like, well, we're a single chain now, but our vision is that there'll be multiple of these chains. You mentioned L3s, right? So a lot of the L2s are saying, we're going to have this whole ecosystem of L3s on top of our L2. We're going to figure out some way for them to communicate with each other. You can launch like an app specific, like roll up. I think that's interesting. That to me tells me that idea is correct. It's just that it's like manifesting like in multiple different like places, like simultaneously using different tech stacks and different approaches. But the core idea is correct.
I hear you. And I mean, the good news is that chains like Moonbeam and others will allow data, tokens, applications to compose between those Ethereum layers 1, 2, and 3. If Ethereum can get its layers together, it can connect to Polkadot. The VM ecosystem can proliferate. So if it does work and it is secure and it is proven, it is performant, everybody still benefits, because it's not, like you said, it's not an island out to itself. We're increasingly getting better at being able to have app builders composed from different parts of different ecosystems. So ultimately, that whether it's a hub and spoke model or whether it's an XCM type model, you still end up with a good news story at the end of it. Hopefully.
I think that's right. I mean, back to that idea of like rhyming, not history, like rhyming, not repeating, and different kinds. I mean, I saw this with the cloud, right? That there was, I think right now there's like all these people producing different kinds of block space, like and with different properties. But in the end, I don't know that like developers are going to care as much. They're going to figure out, okay, I have an app, I need to build that, I need like backend capacity to like run that. What are the different kinds of like capacity that I need? I might need storage capacity, I might need compute capacity, and like there'll be a market for that. Where is that like like cheapest, best, like most performant, most secure, and then like the workloads will migrate there basically, right? It'll be less about, oh, I'm somehow bespoke just like this chain. It might be that you move over time. It might be like, oh, well, the price has changed. Like I moved from Google to like AWS. It might be the same thing here, where you move the workload of your application around depending on market conditions. And so this is where I see the ability to create like customized execution environments. Like that's like something that is unique that Polkadot has in terms of being this like backend cloud, right? So you can have things other than just a vanilla EVM. EVM will probably be good enough for a lot of things, but like for other things, you're going to need to be able to customize like how those workloads are run.
Indeed, I can see different ends of the spectrum too. You can see the race to the bottom of saying, right, who can provide the cheapest, most performant block space, at the same time who can provide the most performant, high value, easy to integrate. It doesn't necessarily have to be whoever can do cheap. I think in the same way you have with SaaS, with cloud, you have everything, and it probably wouldn't be beyond the art of the possible to see an Amazon or a Google or an IBM or an Oracle having a parachain, or starting to say, what, we're going to make a play in this space because our business is software as a service, our business is infrastructure. If there's enough demand there, if there's enough infrastructure there, this is something that we know how to do well. We also know how to sell it, right? And so part of that also is not just selling decentralized compute and storage to 100,000 angry degens on Twitter. It's saying actually, at scale, these guys have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people as a sales force worldwide to be able to bring people in. So, I think when we start seeing those, that's a good indicator that also we're starting to succeed, because there's enough going on building engineering teams who've got familiarity with Rust or EVM than it is trying to build a 100,000 person sales force to go and do enterprise sales. So at some point, we've got to try and find that community out there in the world as well. Yeah. With a couple of minutes left to go, I wanted to get some final thoughts from you, Derek, if that's okay. We've had a few questions from the community, and I appreciate you taking the time that you have. What more do you think we need to see further growth and use of decentralized applications and decentralized tech? It feels like we've got a lot of the infrastructure problems either on the way to being solved or solved. What do you think is the great unlock for us in terms of the next phase of growth?
Yeah, I'm reminded of like the quip of like the real estate adage about location. Like the three things for me, it's like UX basically. It's UX, and UX again. You can peel that back, and that it means like different things, but I still, the story I tell is that like, I came from this Web2 world where we were building an app, a mobile app, and other things that like were used by end users. And so when I described to like a lot of Web3 teams that like, okay, a third of the team was devoted to like UX. Basically, we had like a product design lead that was at the table with like the VP of engineering. We had like people doing like user studies. We had like, we had all these things. And like, you describe that to like a typical Web3 team, they don't even know what you're talking about. They're like, we have a cryptographer, like we got like some engineers, like, and so this is what you realize that like people like Google, Apple, like they are investing like large amounts of money in the UX. And I don't see, I see that as a big challenge. There's just like investment that you need to put into UX. But some of the themes are also like what we talked about earlier, right? So like part of the big improvement in UX and part that we're kind of further down the stack that I feel like we can directly contribute to are these chain agnostic experiences, right? So it's like, it can't be the case that like my mom is going to need to know about like 5 different blockchains that like, of the app she's interacting with. It's just impossible, right? I mean, she made it pretty far. She like, I think she got something from Coinbase, moved to the Ethereum mainnet. She was trying to get to Moonbeam. She's like, went to Wormhole. She's like, I can't figure it out on the other end. So she made it pretty far. She's 70 basically. So like, I was pretty impressed, but even she failed after watching a bunch of YouTube videos. It's just too hard to use these things. There's too many infrastructure elements that we're asking users to deal with. And so that's, to me, is like the key thing. And I feel like the contribution we can make is around, pushing these cross-chain scenarios, because I see that as like a key unlock for creating abstraction, right? So like you present something to the user, but you like hide away like all of these other infrastructure elements you're interacting with via cross-chain messages, for example. That's like a big unlock. So you don't have to have the user know about all of those different things. And there's no way I think we're going to be able to onboard like large amounts of normal users without like dramatic simplifications in the UX. And of course, you don't want it to be that it's solved via centralized service. I mean, we've seen how that went in the, in the last 18 months or what have you. So, you need to keep like this like self-custody concept, but like dramatically simplify the UX. That would be my tip.
So in summary, UX, UX, UX.
That's right.
But maybe UX and DevX and UX and DevX and UX and DevX.
Maybe that.
You get the DevX right, and maybe the devs fix the UX, or maybe it's a kind of a bit of a combined problem. But Derek, it's been fascinating catching up with you. I know we haven't spoken for a long time, but a huge amount of progress being made in the Polkadot ecosystem, huge amount with Moonbeam, and very excited to hear that we're starting to see enterprise growth on the platform as well. 1 million smart contracts deployed. Let that sink in, everybody. Have a brilliant rest of your day, Derek, and stay safe out there.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.